Thank you all for being here and for taking the time. I'm excited to be here and talk about a topic that I'm passionate about, which is cybersecurity strategy. And really, as we start looking towards the early stages of humankind, we sort of came to this realization that we could acquire things of value by exerting violence or even the threat of violence over another person. And as we collectively came to this realization, the idea of warfare was born. And in the thousands upon thousands of years that have occurred since then, there's not been a single moment in recorded human history where the entire world has simultaneously been at peace. Which means that we have gotten really good at warfare. We as a species intimately understand what it takes to launch and successfully execute a warfare campaign. And because of that, we've also innovated a lot in warfare. Bombs, boats, plate armor, firearms, lasers, radios have all allowed us to increase the velocity of warfare and also move warfare into new domains that were previously not thought possible. But the funny thing is, even with all this innovation and all these new players in the warfare space, the preeminent book on warfare strategy was written 7,000 years ago. I'm of course talking about Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which has guided military and business leaders since it was first published in 5 BC. And so what that tells us is that even as the velocity of war increases, new tools are brought in, new domains are entered, and new players join the battle, the fundamental concepts of warfare strategy are shockingly constant. Today, we stand on a precipice of a new evolution of warfare into cyberspace, where wars are won not with kinetic attacks, but with ones and zeros, waged across international boundaries, and sometimes at velocities that are difficult for humans to keep up with. And so as the velocity of warfare continues to increase, I thought it would be helpful to take a step back and look again at Sun Tzu's guidance for warfare strategy and how we could apply it to our own cybersecurity programs. I'm assuming most of the people in this room have probably read The Art of War. It's one of the most popular books ever published. But in case you haven't, The Art of War is divided into 13 chapters, and each chapter is dedicated to a skill or an art that Sun Tzu believed was important for everyone to understand in order to be successful in a warfare campaign. It was essentially a guidebook for Chinese generals to ensure the continued success of the Chinese dynasty long after Sun Tzu died. But as you're reading through these 13 chapters, you'll start to realize some strategies that are pretty consistent through most, if not all, 13 of those chapters. And those 5 strategies are really kind of the basis for these famous quotes you see attributed to Sun Tzu floating around the internet and in books. And so today, I want to take a look at these 5 strategies and some practical ways that we can apply them to our own security programs. And it starts with a focus on victory. In historical warfare, victory was a well understood and clearly defined concept. You sacked a castle, you killed a king, you toppled a government, you defended your land, you took somebody else's land. It was very binary and generally applied the same no matter what type of war was being fought or who was involved in that war. As we've evolved into modern warfare, the idea of victory has become far more nebulous and left up to the definition of those involved, which means that oftentimes it never gets defined at all. Case in point, let's rewind back to October of 2001. The United States invaded Afghanistan shortly following the events of September 11th. We had some very, very clear short-term goals that we wanted to accomplish. We wanted to remove the Taliban-led government, install a government that was more friendly to Western ideals, and of course capture Osama bin Laden and other key Taliban leaders. And we were highly successful at 2 of those 3 objectives. Within 2 months, we had control of every major city in Afghanistan and control of the Afghani government. But we didn't really know what we wanted to do long term, did we? We knew we didn't want to turn Afghanistan into a US state or a territory. We knew we didn't want to conquer Afghanistan. We knew we didn't want to be there forever, but we didn't know what we wanted to do. So we just kept fighting. And what was the result? 20 years later, we exit Afghanistan. We spent between $1 and $3 trillion, depending on which estimate you believe, about 5,000 dead American soldiers and 50,000 dead civilians. And we lost the entire country 2 weeks after we left. If you fail to define victory, you can be almost certain you will never achieve it. And our security programs run that exact same risk, because victory in cybersecurity is very difficult to define. So let's start right there. Let's start by defining what victory means to our organization. And that really requires security leaders to do 3 things. The first of those is to have a conversation with the highest leaders in your organization, whether that's a board of directors, a board of trustees, a president, a CEO, whatever that looks like, someone who is accountable for corporate governance. And it requires us to talk with them about acceptable loss. Because we are in a war, and in war, there are always losses. We need to understand how much can we lose and still be okay. This is defined many different ways: acceptable loss, acceptable risk, risk thresholds. There's a lot of different ways to look at it, but the core idea is that question right there. Our organization delivers value XYZ, and we are willing to accept X percentage of X loss in order to deliver that value. I'm not going to pretend like that's an easy conversation to have. I would even wager that most corporate directors are not prepared for that conversation. So it requires some education in order to get them there, because we need to make that declarative statement in order to understand what our victory criteria is. Because that also empowers us to have the next conversation, which is very similar. It allows us to talk to our business unit owners, usually a director or a VP, somebody who owns a line of business within the organization. And it's very similar in that we want to understand how much risk they themselves are willing to accept for their business unit. This allows us to get that same declarative statement. Our business unit delivers XYZ value, is able to, and is willing to take on X amount of risk of X amount of loss in order to deliver that. Once you have those 2 pieces of information, it enables the rest of your security program because you understand what victory is. The third thing that we need to do is to take those 2 pieces of information and create a vision and a mission statement for your cybersecurity team. If this sounds a little corny, that's okay. You probably already have one for your organization. Almost every organization creates a vision statement. But it's important that you have one specific to your security team. There's no way around it. Security is a difficult job. We have record levels of burnout within our industry. A lot of people can't define why we're even doing security in the first place. And that vision statement helps them to understand where we're headed, why we're headed there, and what we're going to look like when we get there. That gives them a common ideal to rally behind as a security team and something to believe in that is larger than themselves. It's very powerful, not only for your security team and the way that they operate, but for retention and recruiting across the cybersecurity industry. Next, we need to take those definitions of victory and we need to educate the organization. Our job as security professionals is one of education. And if you think that it is not, then you're in the wrong industry, because we need to be educating everyone. People do not understand cybersecurity the way that we do. and they likely never will. And so it is our job to take that definition of victory and educate them on not only where it's at, but what we're doing to get there and how they can help us achieve it. It's important that they feel invested in that vision and in the security of the organization to be able to reach that. It also allows you to move from the office of no to a business enabler. Let's go back to our business unit owner. They've now set a threshold of acceptable risk that they believe their business unit should operate within. If we have a product owner who really wants to deliver a new feature, and that new feature introduces an unacceptable level of risk based on that designation, it's no longer you saying no to them, it's their VP or their director. And what you can do is be a partner and saying, your VP is not willing to accept this level of risk, but here's some tools that I can partner with you on to bring that level of risk down to something that is palatable. You've just become a partner to the business instead of being the office of no, as we've historically been known to do. Finally, we need to build our teams around the idea of excellence. For those of you that do know me, I'm a huge Patriots fan. It's okay, you can go and roll your eyes, everybody else does. And I've been a fan my entire life. Since 94, 95 was when I first started watching games. And one of the things that has consistently impressed me about the organization is the commitment to excellence, especially during Bill Belichick's tenure. He's a huge fan of Art of War and quotes it constantly. And one of the key ideas that he builds around is that every player who comes through that organization is there to do one thing and one thing only: your job at the highest possible level to help the team achieve victory. The results speak for themselves. And what we have seen in cybersecurity is more sprawl than that, is we expect perfection from our teams, perfection from people. Perfection is something entirely different. We need to focus on excellence. Come in, do your job at the highest possible level to help the team achieve the victory criteria that we set out. That excellence, that high bar, helps your team to understand what they need to do and how they need to operate in order for that victory criteria to be met. But it brings up a fair question. How do you know when you're being excellent? That's a challenging question, and one that the industry as a whole has honestly not figured out. But this is where your metrics program comes in place. I'm a huge fan of risk measurement and measurement in general, and one of the things that you will quickly figure out when you go to measure anything is anything that you measure will improve. And so it's important for you to understand what metrics you're measuring and why you're measuring them in order for those things and the right things to improve. So I want to talk a bit about how we're building a metrics program right now and the model that we're building it around to hopefully give you all some ideas how you can build your own metrics program. It's when we started looking at metrics and what stories we were trying to tell, we really understood that there were three broad categories or customers that we were delivering this story to. And so we started grouping our metrics around these three stories so that we could reach our major audiences or our major customers and tell the story we wanted to tell. The first of those are your strategic level metrics. These are your board and executive level, the things you take to justify why your program exists and how it's performing at a business level. I'm a huge fan of cyber risk quantification. This is where you're going to use those numbers, even if you're not using cyber risk quantification. Everything at the strategic level should be focused around risk and business enablement. You are here to speak business at the strategy level. The next is our operational level. These are for those business owners, your directors, your VPs, your risk owners. These are going to be very similar to your strategic level metrics, but focused around risk ownership and focused on their business unit. This is also a fantastic place where you can slip in what I call marketing metrics, which are the cool things that your program has accomplished over the past 3-6 months, whatever your reporting period is, that helps you build stakeholder buy-in across your organization, which we'll be talking more about later. And the final story that we're trying to tell is tactical. These are for you and your security leadership to understand exactly how your team is performing. And these are the ones that are very, very important to get right at a tactical level. Because again, whatever you're measuring here is what your people are going to work on to improve. So understanding what you're measuring them by, what is going to change if that metric were to improve, and conversely, what's going to change if that metric gets worse, and making conscious decisions about what you're measuring people by and how you are judging them toward excellence. The next strategy I want to talk about is a paraphrase of probably the most famous Sun Tzu quote out there. Know yourself and know your enemy. Everyone has heard this quote. And in cybersecurity, knowing yourself means to be able to answer two questions. What are my assets and what are my capabilities? And they seem like really simple questions to ask, right? But we all know it's not that easy. So when I mention the word assets, everyone in this room probably gets a slightly different idea of what I mean when I say asset. We probably start with tangible assets, a server, an endpoint, a printer, data, people, buildings, things that we purchased or that have a tangible value and that we are concerned about protecting. And that's an excellent starting point. But it's just that, a starting point. We need to take that a step further. We need to understand revenue generation. Every single organization represented in this room exists and continues to exist because of revenue generation. Whether you have customers, whether you sell to other businesses, whether you get federal grants, whether you have trustees giving you endowments or GoFundMe accounts, there is some way that money is flowing into the organization, paying the bills, paying people, and allowing the organization to continue to operate. And the very sad reality is that the vast majority of cybersecurity professionals, including CISOs, cannot explain to you the revenue cycle of their organization. We can't read a profit and loss statement. We can't read a 10K. We don't know how the money works. Our entire job is to protect that business value. Because you know who does understand our revenue cycle? Threat actors. They spend a lot of time researching it. They understand where money comes in, where it flows through, who your key suppliers are, where your strategic dependencies are. Because what they figured out very quickly is that if they can stop the money train from moving, we will pay exorbitant amounts of money to get it moving again. And that's the ransomware problem in a nutshell. I encourage everyone to spend time with your finance people. I know it's not fun. Nobody dreams about spending time with finance people. But it's an important conversation to understand how your revenue cycle works and what you're actually defending. The second thing that we need to understand are our capabilities as a security team. And I use the word capabilities very intentionally, not tools, because tools and capabilities get mixed up a lot, and they're not the same thing. A capability is the outcome that you can drive, or your team can drive, with the collection of people, processes, and technology. Tools are a huge piece of that, but it is not all of it. We need to intimately understand what outcomes we can drive. Where do we have visibility into the kill chain? Where can we disrupt the kill chain? What are our recovery capabilities to different kinds of attacks? It is imperative that we understand what we can do, and more importantly, what we cannot do. Because the next step is to understand our enemy. If anyone in this room has done threat modeling before, you will understand what I'm saying when you start threat modeling, you usually come in very naively and full of exuberance to conquer the world, boil the ocean, and understand all these threat actors. It takes about 2 hours before you realize there are more threat actors than there are minutes in the day, and it's literally impossible to model all of them. So you know right away you need to start narrowing it down to just those that matter. And so you introduce threat intelligence to start understanding what threat actors are reasonably likely to pose a threat to my organization, whether that's because of the industry I operate in, what geographical area I'm headquartered in, what political changes there's been within my space, or just the color on my logo. Who is targeting my organization? And once you understand that, and you've shrunk that pool down to the threat community that's relevant to you, then you need to understand what are their capabilities? What outcomes can they drive? Because ultimately, that's what we need to understand. How do they operate? What tools do they have available to them? How well resourced are they? Do they focus on identity-based attacks? Those types of questions will help you to intimately understand where you need protections in order to disrupt how that threat actor operates. Because the final thing we need to do is focus on the intersection between those two things. Every single war is won and lost at the intersection of capabilities. What can one threat actor do that the other cannot defend against? And we see this throughout history, even in conventional or ancient warfare. Genghis Khan built the largest empire in human history because he had a capability, the bow and arrow, that his army had mastered. So a weapon, a people, and a process to use it that no other army was able to match for nearly 100 years. And that capability allowed him to win. So that intersection is where we need to focus our defense efforts. This can, again, be challenging. This is where tools like the MITRE ATT&CK framework become incredibly useful. I don't know how many people here are familiar with MITRE ATT&CK. It is one of my absolutely favorite tools. It lays out a map of all of the different techniques that threat actors use to all the way from recon to exfiltration out of your environment. I believe there's 240 something techniques in there as of today. And it allows you to understand not only what techniques are they using, but what techniques can I detect? What ones can I disrupt? What ones can I block? And help you to give a holistic understanding of what capabilities you have mapped right alongside the capabilities of your adversaries. It's also a fantastic tool for one of those strategic metrics that we talked about. The MITRE ATT&CK framework in and of itself is very tactical, very technical. It goes super down in the weeds. But you can take something, let's say that as of today, I have determined that my organization, the threat actors targeting my organization, use 150 of those 240 techniques. And of those 150 that they are likely to use, I can detect 70 of them. That's not very good. I know I need to shore up those other 150. So I spend a bunch of money, I focus on it for 12 months, and at the end of the day, I'm able to detect 140 of them 12 months later. I can now go to my board, go to my executive level, and say, I have increased our detection capabilities by 100%, and I can now cover 90% of the likely attack methods. It's not perfect, but it's a quantifiable way to show improvement in your security program for some of the investment that's been made. Next, I want to talk about allies. When you think into historical warfare, it was often one army fighting another army. Whether it was the Romans versus the Greeks or the Greeks versus the Macedonians, it was one army fighting another. As we have progressed into modern warfare, there is no such thing as one army fighting another. It does not happen anymore. And we're seeing that play out live in living color with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russia is not fighting Ukraine. Russia, some Eastern Bloc countries, with some tepid support from Iran, China, and North Korea, are attacking Ukraine, who has support from the European Union, Germany, Switzerland, the UK, and the United States. There are always an attachment of actors who are fighting proxy wars attached to the individuals or organizations who are actually fighting the war. Cybersecurity is no different. Threat actors do not work in a vacuum anymore. They used to 20, 30 years ago. They collaborate really, really well. You heard earlier about initial access brokers. That's become an increasingly common tactic for threat actors to pass attacks off along the kill chain to other groups that have specialties on that piece of the kill chain. And so we see them working together. We've even seen members of threat actor groups floating between different groups simultaneously, so it's difficult to attribute them to one single group. They have their allies, and we have ours. We, of course, have our internal allies, people in our organization who are supporting our cybersecurity programs, which we'll talk more about in a bit. But then we have our external allies, a lot of who we see here today. There are vendors that provide a capability that we either don't have the time, don't have the budget, or don't have the expertise to build ourselves. And remember, again, a capability is more than technology. So we often think of vendors as providing us a tool. A vendor needs to provide a capability, a collection of people, processes, and technology that allows you to achieve an outcome you could not achieve before. So whether that's consulting or expertise or staff augmentation or, yes, a tool or a full-scale managed service. We also need to understand how we are picking our allies. The cybersecurity market has become incredibly commoditized over the past 5 to 10 years. All of that sweet VC money that's floating around has led to this rapid increase in the commoditization of the cybersecurity market. There's free gifts just to get you to take a meeting with a vendor to talk about their technology. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it should not be how we are selecting our vendors. And it's happening far too often. I grew up in the government space, so I'm a sucker for a good RFP process. I love them. The government takes it a little bit too far, which is why they move so slowly procuring new technology. But one of the key takeaways from that government procurement process is that we need to have a structured way of selecting who our allies are going to be. For example, I do not select any of the technology for my security team. I've democratized that process. I'm a piece of the process, but I'm not the process. And that's intentional. One, because it's a lot harder to bribe 10 people instead of just trying to bribe me. I'm saving the organization from myself. I'm human. The organization should not be at the whims of whether somebody gave me a nice gift or whether I liked them more than the other sales rep. Democratizing that process abstracts some out of it. The second thing, I am not an expert. I have 136 capabilities within my current scope. And if you think I'm an expert on all of them, I have a bridge to sell you. I have people who are experts, a lot of people who are really smart. Some of them are here today. I trust them. They know these technologies. They know what we need and what we don't need. If we remove our own ego from that selection process, it's almost entirely clear that we should not be the deciding factor. I'm not going to tell you all that you need to do a full RFP on every technology purchase you make. I think the ally or a new partner in that space. The next thing I want to talk about is coordination. When we think back to 1941, World War II was just beginning. It was very contained to Europe at the time, but it was already clear it was going to be a significant conflict. The United States was a couple decades removed from World War I and had no desire to be directly involved. We had a booming industrial economy that was producing at a scale that even 50 years before, people would have thought you were crazy if you talked about the output level that was coming out of our industrial economy during that time. And so we wanted to focus on that. We wanted to focus on continuing to build our economy and living the good life that we had built within the United States. And so we provided some proxy support through Great Britain, providing some arms and funding and things like that, but we did not want to get directly involved. And then Pearl Harbor happened, and we jumped face first into the World War. And almost overnight, we turned that massive industrial economy into the largest war machine the world has ever seen, and probably the largest we will ever see. Advances in technology mean you no longer even need an army the size of what we built for World War II. The number of people, tanks, planes, weapons that we amassed was intimidating and shocking to everyone else involved, including our allies. How did we do that? How did we turn an industrial economy into a war machine so quickly? We coordinated. From the very lowest, poorest American to the youngest, oldest American, everyone's lives were impacted by the war effort. Whether it was something as simple as you couldn't buy the groceries you wanted anymore, not being able to buy pantyhose, changing some of your spending habits and buying war bonds, or even going to work in a factory, every single American was behind the war effort. Coordination, top to bottom, across the entire country, because that's what it takes to win a war. How do we capture that same level of coordination within our own organizations toward our own cyber war? In order to do that, it starts by us becoming a part of the organization. Every American felt like they were part of the war effort. You can see the posters from back in the 40s talking about how you were doing something. The famous pointing Uncle Sam, we want you. Every American felt like they were part of the war. In order for cybersecurity to achieve that same level of buy-in, we need to become part of the organization. For a long time, we have seen ourselves as these mages working in the basement, weaving our dark security magic. And we stand in front of the organization with a shield protecting them from all these threats that go bump in the internet. That is no longer workable. It's not working. We need to become part of the organization that we are trying to defend. Our goal is no longer to defend the organization. Our goal should be to enable the organization to defend itself, to allow it to behave in a secure manner that enables operations to continue. And this is where cyber risk quantification becomes such a huge tool. If you go out and talk to everyone and say, there's this critical risk, these critical problems, they're red, they're 5s, they're 3s, they're low, mediums, highs, I guarantee their eyes are rolling. They don't know what that means. Half of us don't know what it means. We need to be able to communicate in the way that business communicates. Money. We need to be able to talk about loss probabilities. We need to be able to talk about what the impact to the organization would be if there were a loss event. It is critical that we learn the vernacular of the organization in order to enable its own defense. Case in point, I joined the health system just over a year ago. We were still doing virtual orientations because of COVID, and so they have this video that plays at the beginning of our orientation. This is my first day. And maybe 3 minutes into this video, our CEO says that the health system does not compete with other health systems in the Midwest. We compete with the top 10% of health systems nationwide. That's the benchmark we set for ourselves, along one single metric, patient care, and the associated metrics with patient care. That was the single most valuable thing he could have possibly done for me as an incoming security leader. because I now immediately understand that everything that I'm doing, everything that the security team is doing, everything the security team is going to do needs to be centered around patient care. How are we enabling patient care? How are we protecting patient care, et cetera? So for my first board presentation, with our roadmap laid out, it was all centered around what it's doing to protect the hospital's ability to provide patient care. And it was immediately well received. In order to enable that protection of the business, we have to become a part of it. In order to become a part of it, we need to understand how it operates, how it speaks, what's important to it, what's not important to it. This is how every other executive in the business operates, except security in a modern day organization. The next thing we need to do is to use that position of becoming part of the organization to build support and rapport across the organization. Because you are aligning with the way the business operates and with the way the business speaks, this job becomes a lot easier. Because ultimately, everyone wants to do a good job in their role. They are trying to make the best decision they have with the information they have available. Where we have failed as an industry is that we do not provide them meaningful information that allows them to make an informed decision, understanding what the impacts are, not only from a security perspective, but from an organizational perspective. And once we start doing that, we will quickly realize that people that we thought were obstacles become allies very, very quickly, because now they see how helping security or doing security is part of doing their job. A perfect analogy that a friend of mine came up with is a restaurant and health codes. If you went into a restaurant and you ask your waitress or waiter, what are you doing to make sure I don't get food poisoning? Or what are you doing to keep the tables sanitary? They'll look at you kind of funny. They're not doing anything to keep the tables sanitary. Why? Because that's all baked into their job already. They don't view it as a separate role. Wiping down the tables, washing their hands, keeping food at temperature is all part of their job. They just view that as part of being a waiter or a waitress, is doing those tasks. That's the goal that we need for security in order to build this support across the organization, where security is viewed as just part of their job, instead of at a restaurant, what would happen to service levels if they had to call the health department every time a customer left to come and wipe down a table or come and check food temperatures? Service levels would drop and the restaurant would not be able to operate. That's exactly how we operate in security today. We expect security to be a gate for everything else the organization does, instead of enabling people to do things securely as part of their normal day-to-day operations. I would also be remiss if I didn't talk about coordination outside your organization, specifically talking about our government partners. There are more cybersecurity resources available at this local, state, and federal level than there has been ever. Tons of them. We can argue about the effectiveness of some of those services for anyone who has used them before, but they are there, especially if your organization in critical infrastructure with very little budget. Those services can provide a ton of value. At the very least, government services are perfectly equipped to be able to do attack disruption or hacking back, things that we cannot and should not be doing. Learn to coordinate with your government partners. Know who your FBI rep is. Know who your CISA rep is. Know who your state government rep is, especially if you're in a critical infrastructure role. Being able to reach out to them quickly allows you to coordinate with them quickly, cutting down that time to respond in the event that something does happen. Next, and finally, I want to talk about avoiding losing. And if you laugh a little bit when I say that, it's perfectly okay, because no duh, don't lose. That's easy. When we talk about avoiding losing, we're talking about the easy mistakes. I have to go back to my Patriots, because for the past 2 decades, we have been consistently one of the fewest penalized and fewest turnover teams in the NFL. Those are the easy mistakes. Giving away free yardage, giving away free possessions, giving away free points that allows your enemy ways to move forward with encountering little, if any, opposition. What does that look like in cyber? That's legacy servers. That's misconfigured cloud instances. That's unprotected privileged accounts. And I don't mean easy as in they're easy to fix, because they're not. They're not sexy. They're not fun. You don't like spending time on them. Nobody does. I'm talking about easy as in they're easy to exploit. Any script kiddie with 10 minutes on their hand can exploit that machine. And now you're fighting uphill. By spending time focusing on these things, it makes sure that you're not giving away a free advantage and giving your team that upper hand that we originally have, because we should know our environment better than anybody. I also believe that there is a tremendous amount of defeatism in the cybersecurity industry today. We've taken that idea of when, not if, and we've almost turned this into a depressing rallying cry, that we're just sitting there waiting to get pwned and lose our job. And that's sad. Yes, you are going to get attacked. It's a statistical probability. You're going to get attacked. You will have losses. We know this. We're in a war. Wars always have losses. In traditional warfare, those were human lives. Those were people, civilians that would die, soldiers. In cyberspace, it's data breaches, it's ransomware, it's business disruptions, it's things that cost your organization money. But just because we lose a battle doesn't mean we need to lose a war. We need to focus on resiliency, being able to recover quickly, detect and contain, which is why incident response is an absolutely critical part of any security org. I would actually argue that the less mature your environment is, the more you need to focus on incident response, containment, and recovery, because there's even more paths for your organization to be breached. And so your goal then is less protection and more being able to limit the damage of those attacks that are going to be coming, and then shift to protection. Focus on incident response. Make sure you understand what outcomes you can drive within that incident response space. How quickly can you recover? How much is it going to cost you if you're down another day or down another week? And then be able to use that as a pitch to the business to continue investing in incident response. Because once we tell that story, everyone understands business disruption. Everyone understands revenue loss. And when you can tell them that you can reduce that revenue loss, reduce the time of that business disruption, it becomes an attractive investment. But the core idea is that yes, we are going to get attacked. Yes, we are going to suffer losses. But in order to win a war, you have to be able to take that punch in the face, get right back up, and get right back up and ready for the next battle, because that is how you win a war. Thank you again, everyone, for your time today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Questions?
We definitely have a virtual question, but before we do that, is there any questions in here? Okay, I have one in the back.
Hey, Michael, first off, wonderful presentation. I love The Art of War. It's a great book. Good analogies. So you talk about upping the game by learning the business speak and understanding how finances work and those KPIs. Maybe a question is, how do you find time to do your day job and the strategic planning and then go try to learn all of those things in your off hours. Can you explain how you've done that, some best practices of learning how to up that game?
I would start by saying that learning that information is part of your job, especially if you're in a CISO role. If you don't view understanding that information as part of your job, you're doing it wrong. Because it goes back to that core idea of what are you protecting? Why are we doing all of this? Why are we doing security in the first place? It's not to stop hackers. It's to secure business. And once we understand that, we need to be able to understand what we're protecting in order to effectively protect it. So my advice would be is to make it part of your job. Make it part of what you spend your 9 to 5 on, is understanding how the business operates. It's not a side project you need to do on the weekends, unless you're just a masochist and really want to learn. But make it part of your job. Make it part of the job for the people on your security teams, is to understand the business. Because if you don't understand what you're protecting, there is absolutely no way you will ever protect it effectively.
Thank you.
We have a virtual question from Jijo. How to effectively secure the edge? That's the whole question.
That's a very tactical question. And I will start by saying, again, I'm not an expert. I do not consider myself an expert. But when you're talking about securing the edge, it becomes much less about prevention because you do not have control over the device. A lot of the security strategies that we have employed throughout the years have been very focused on control. We start with a device that's fully managed. We put all of our security suite on it, and it allows us positive control over that device and everything that it does. And then BYOD came along and kicked all of that to the curb, and we've been playing catch up ever since. And so by understanding that, number one, you do not have that control, and so you do need to switch to an identity-based security model. Because that identity-based security controls are what allows you to build a profile off of how that device is supposed to operate. And then, the whole zero trust, I'll throw the first buzzword out there, the zero trust approach of enabling policy-based access control and continuous authorization that allows you to get control over those edge devices. It's not the same type of control that we had before, and it's never going to be. It's going to continue to get worse as far as how little control we have over the device. But it does allow us to make decisions based off of the level of control we have, the posture of that device, and get much more granular and use context-aware decisions, whereas before we were using things like trusted devices because we have that control. So move away from the idea that you're going to be able to control the device and instead focus on what decisions you can make based on that lack of control.
We have another question here.
Michael, thanks. Great presentation.
Thank you.
My question revolves around that financial and getting to know the business piece,
Yep.
as I'm sure a lot of people have it. But some of us have some additional challenges where the business doesn't even know how it really works, or it's disconnected in a way to where you're a very diverse industry, and every location or every instance of the business does something differently or recognizes something differently, and there's no real centralized standard, for lack of a better way to do it. How would you attack something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's one of the core reasons why you can't just slap a framework into every corporation, because no two of them operate the same. This is my first foray into healthcare, and you always hear about how messy healthcare is. It's more messy than you think it is, no matter how messy you think it is. And it's around a lot of what you're saying is that each business unit sometimes can operate entirely differently. Sometimes they use different financial models, different ways of forecasting, different ways of representing revenue, representing profit. And so in many ways, you can almost treat each of those business units as a separate company, and you may not be able to roll them all into one overarching organizational risk understanding or risk quantification, but you can go into each of those business units and understand how they operate. As messy as it gets, there is usually always one person who knows where the money comes from, and it's your controller or your CFO. And so talk to them and just map out the money line. Where does money come in? Where does it exist while it's here? What do we do with it while we have control of it? And who do we pay? Start with some really basic questions and then kind of drill your way down from there. And you'll be surprised how quickly you can kind of get a pretty good map of how the organization operates just by following the money.
Do we have any other questions? People don't like to ask questions in front of the mic. So I think that's it. Thank you, Michael. That
Thank
was
you.
amazing.